Your hand is already moving toward the window button before your brain even catches up with what's happening. Blue lights behind you, dark road, late evening. Maybe you already know your tint is darker than your state allows. Maybe you bought the car that way. Maybe you honestly thought nobody cared anymore because you see half the city driving around with blackout tint every single day. And then suddenly those lights appear behind you, and something strange happens that most drivers never think about until it's too late. The traffic stop isn't really starting when the officer reaches your door. It starts the second they decide to pull behind you. That's the part people misunderstand. Before a single word is spoken, before your license is requested, before your registration comes out of the glove box, an entire mental assessment is already happening inside that patrol car. And if you think tinted window stops are just about tint, you're already making the exact mistake officers quietly rely on. So, let me ask you something. Have you ever been pulled over for tinted windows? And did the stop feel like it became much bigger than the tint itself? Tell me what happened in the comments because the details matter more than most people realize. And once you understand how these stops actually unfold, you'll never look at them the same way again. Most drivers think window tint violations are minor equipment stops. Technically, in many cases, they are. But in real-world policing across the United States, tint stops often become fishing expeditions for completely unrelated issues. That's the uncomfortable truth nobody explains clearly enough. And before somebody gets angry hearing that word, let's be honest about reality for a second. Officers are trained to observe patterns. Dark tint limits visibility. Limited visibility increases uncertainty. Uncertainty changes officer behavior immediately. That means a stop that might otherwise stay casual suddenly becomes more tactical, more suspicious, and far more investigative from the very first second. You have to understand what the officer is thinking before you understand how drivers accidentally make everything worse. Imagine sitting inside a patrol vehicle late at night. You run a plate. The tint is extremely dark. You cannot clearly see movement inside the vehicle. You don't know how many occupants are inside. You don't know whether somebody is reaching under a seat, hiding something, recording, panicking, loading a weapon, or simply grabbing insurance paperwork. That uncertainty changes the emotional tone of the encounter before contact is even made. And here's where many drivers unintentionally trigger additional suspicion. The second the lights come on, panic takes over. Some drivers instantly roll the window halfway down. Some roll it all the way down aggressively. Some open the door immediately. Some begin digging around the center console before the officer even exits the patrol car. Some shut the engine off dramatically like they're trying to prove obedience. Some turn their whole body repeatedly toward the passenger seat. Some attempt to wipe away smoke. Some throw objects into the back. Some start explaining themselves before anyone asks a question. And believe it or not, officers notice every single one of those movements, not later. Immediately. That's why experienced defense attorneys constantly warn clients that the first 30 seconds of a traffic stop matter more than almost anything said afterward, because officers are building observations in real time. Driver appeared nervous. Driver made furtive movements. Driver avoided eye contact. Driver reached toward floorboard. Strong odor detected after window lowered. Driver immediately began unsolicited explanations. People laugh at those phrases until they see them typed into official reports. Then suddenly, it becomes real. Now, let's talk about the specific mistake drivers make during tinted window stops that creates unnecessary legal problems. The moment the officer approaches, many people try too hard to sound cooperative. That sounds harmless, right? Actually, sometimes it becomes disastrous. The officer walks up and says something simple. "Reason I stopped you is your tint looks too dark." And instantly the driver says something like, "Yeah, I know, I've been meaning to remove it. I just bought the car like this. I only tinted it because cops kept staring into my car. I got the darkest legal option. It's illegal in another state, but not here. I hope you're not going to ticket me for this." People think they're being conversational, but what they're really doing is volunteering statements, and volunteered statements become evidence. Now suddenly the stop is no longer just visual suspicion from the officer. Now there's verbal acknowledgement tied directly to the violation itself. This is exactly why lawyers constantly tell drivers to stop talking unnecessarily during traffic stops. Not because silence magically prevents tickets, not because officers are automatically dishonest, but because nervous people talk themselves into deeper problems every single day, especially during equipment stops like tint violations, where the officer may already be deciding whether the situation deserves more scrutiny. Now here's the sentence that matters more than people realize when an officer approaches a tinted window stop. Instead of immediately explaining yourself, arguing, apologizing, or confessing, stay calm and say something simple and controlled. Officer, before I reach for anything, where would you like me to place my hands? That sentence changes the tone of the stop in ways most people never understand. Notice what it does psychologically. It communicates calmness. It communicates awareness. It communicates non-aggression. It communicates cooperation without volunteering guilt. And most importantly, it reduces uncertainty. Remember earlier when I said uncertainty changes officer behavior? That sentence helps lower uncertainty immediately, because now the officer sees a driver thinking carefully instead of emotionally. That matters a lot, especially on nighttime tint stops. Now let's get into something even more important that rarely gets discussed publicly. Many tint stops quietly evolve into DUI or drug investigations not because of the tint itself, but because drivers unknowingly create additional probable cause during the interaction. This happens constantly. A driver gets stopped for tint. Officer approaches. Window comes down. Strong smell of marijuana exits vehicle. Open alcohol container visible. Eyes appear bloodshot. Speech sounds slurred. Driver fumbles basic questions. Passengers begin acting strangely. And suddenly the original stop becomes almost irrelevant. People later say, I got pulled over just for tint. Not exactly. Tint started the contact. Everything afterward expanded the investigation. That distinction matters legally. Very few people understand how traffic stop escalation actually works in practice. Officers are trained to observe cumulative indicators, not just one thing. Multiple small observations stacking together create suspicion momentum. And nervous drivers unknowingly contribute to that momentum constantly. Now, let's talk about lowering the window itself, because this is where social media has completely confused people. Some online personalities tell drivers never to lower the window more than 1 inch. Others say crack it barely enough for communication. Others insist fully lowering the window is safest. Reality is more nuanced. If your tint is extremely dark and the officer cannot see inside clearly, refusing to lower the window enough for safe communication can escalate tension fast, especially at night. Remember, the officer's concern is visibility and control. If they cannot see your hands clearly, they become more alert, not less. That doesn't mean you surrender every right you have. It means smart drivers avoid creating unnecessary suspicion through bizarre behavior. There's a difference. And mature drivers understand that distinction better than emotional drivers do. One of the biggest myths online is the belief that every officer is desperately searching every car. That mindset alone causes people to behave strangely. Calm drivers generally do better than performative drivers. Now, here's another critical detail people rarely discuss. Tint stops are often used because they are easy legal justifications for initiating contact when an officer already noticed something else beforehand. Maybe lane drifting, maybe extremely slow driving, maybe a broken taillight, maybe suspicious behavior at a gas station, maybe a BOLO alert matching the vehicle, maybe visible phone usage, maybe erratic braking. The tint simply becomes the cleanest initial reason for the stop. That's why some drivers feel shocked when the officer seems interested in much more than the windows. The officer may have already been observing you long before the lights activated. This becomes especially important when drivers start asking dangerous questions like, "Why are you really pulling me over?" That question almost never improves the situation. And emotionally challenging an officer during the first minute of a stop usually creates tension instead of leverage. Courtrooms are where legality gets challenged. Roadside arguments mostly create additional observations. Now, let's discuss body language because people underestimate how much officers rely on behavioral interpretation. A calm driver with both hands visible tends to reduce perceived threat levels immediately. A driver twisting around repeatedly toward the back seat raises concern. A driver exiting unexpectedly raises concern. A driver aggressively filming while shouting before contact even occurs raises concern. Again, none of this automatically makes somebody guilty of anything, but behavior shapes the tone of encounters. That's reality. And experienced attorneys know juries often care deeply about behavioral impressions described in police reports and body cam footage. One small movement can suddenly sound sinister once written formally. Driver appeared unusually anxious. Driver repeatedly glanced toward passenger floorboard. Driver hesitated before answering. These details sound minor until prosecutors begin building narratives around them. Now, here's where a tinted window stops become especially risky for younger drivers. Many young people treat the stop like social conflict instead of legal interaction. Huge mistake. Sarcasm hurts people constantly during traffic stops. So does ego. So does trying to win. An officer says, "Your tint appears darker than state law allows." And the driver responds, "Everybody has tint. You should catch real criminals. This is harassment. You only stopped me because of the car." Even if the frustration feels emotionally justified, none of those statements help the driver. In fact, they often encourage deeper scrutiny. People forget officers possess enormous discretionary authority during routine stops. Tone influences discretion more than most people realize. Now, let's address something else nobody talks about enough. Passengers can destroy a stop faster than drivers. One loud passenger can completely shift the energy. One drunk friend, one person making jokes, one person recording aggressively from 6 inches away, one person yelling legal advice from TikTok, and suddenly a basic tint stop turns chaotic. Good drivers understand crowd control matters. You cannot fully control officers, but you can absolutely control your own behavior and vehicle environment. That matters legally. Now here's something extremely important regarding consent searches. Tint stops often lead to casual conversational probing. Mind if I take a look inside? Anything illegal in the vehicle? You don't mind if I search real quick, right? Notice the language. Casual, relaxed, non-threatening. That's intentional. Many people accidentally consent because they feel social pressure instead of legal obligation. And once consent is granted, entire cases change direction immediately. That's why attorneys repeatedly emphasize calm clarity. Not aggression, not hostility. Clarity. A respectful response like, "I don't consent to searches, officer," is completely different from yelling, "You're violating my rights." One sounds controlled. The other sounds emotionally escalated. Words matter. Delivery matters. Body language matters. Everything becomes part of the interaction record. And here's the uncomfortable reality most drivers only discover later. Officers are often evaluating credibility more than the actual answers themselves. That means inconsistent explanations become dangerous fast. Where are you headed? Where are you coming from? Who owns the car? How long have you been driving tonight? Simple questions become credibility tests, especially if multiple occupants provide conflicting answers. One person says they're coming from dinner. Another says they were at a party. Another says they just left a friend's house. Suddenly, suspicion grows, not necessarily because of criminal activity, because inconsistency itself triggers investigative curiosity. This is exactly why experienced defense lawyers constantly tell people not to ramble. Short, calm, accurate responses usually create fewer problems than nervous over-explaining. Now, let me tell you about one of the biggest mistakes drivers make during tint stops. They mistake politeness for protection. Being polite is smart, but politeness does not mean volunteering information endlessly. Some drivers think if they act extra friendly, they can talk their way out of scrutiny. Sometimes the opposite happens. The more somebody talks, the more opportunities they create for contradictions, admissions, or suspicious statements. Officers know nervous people often fill silence with unnecessary information. That's why pauses during traffic stops feel psychologically uncomfortable. Silence pressures people, and pressured people speak carelessly. Now there's another layer to tint stops that people almost never think about. Officer safety positioning. Have you ever noticed many officers stop slightly offset behind vehicles? There's a reason. They're creating visibility angles. They're watching mirrors. They're watching silhouettes. They're watching head movement inside the cabin. Dark tint interferes with those visual assessments. That's why some officers approach tint stops more cautiously than ordinary equipment violations. Again, understanding perspective matters. Drivers who understand officer psychology tend to handle stops more intelligently, not emotionally. Now, let's talk about recording. In most places, recording police in public is lawful if you are not interfering, but the way people record matters enormously. Quiet recording is very different from theatrical confrontation. Some drivers intentionally escalate because they believe conflict itself creates internet content. Terrible strategy. Because once tension rises, everything becomes harder. Communication becomes harder. Discretion disappears. Minor issues become formal enforcement. And suddenly people who might have received warnings end up receiving citations, or worse. Experienced attorneys see this constantly. Emotion ruins otherwise manageable encounters. Now, let's discuss what happens after the citation itself, because many people accidentally damage their own cases right there at the window. The officer hands over the ticket, and the driver says something disastrous like, "Fine, whatever. I know the tint is illegal anyway." Or, "I'll just pay it." People think these statements are meaningless, but remember something important. Traffic stops are documented, body cams exist, dash cams exist, admissions matter, even casual statements matter, especially if the issue later becomes contested in court. Now here's something people really need to understand about tint laws across the United States. They vary dramatically. Some states allow darker rear tint. Some regulate reflectivity. Some allow medical exemptions. Some enforce aggressively. Others barely enforce at all, unless tied to another issue. That inconsistency creates confusion for drivers traveling across state lines. And confusion creates confidence mistakes. People assume legality transfers universally. It doesn't. That's why drivers moving between states often get surprised during stops. Now here's where things become even more complicated. Modern vehicles already come with factory tint on certain windows. Then owners add aftermarket tint on top. Suddenly visibility percentages drop far below legal thresholds without drivers fully realizing it. Officers know this, and specialized tint meters exist precisely for enforcement purposes. So, arguing emotionally roadside about percentages rarely helps. Court is where evidence gets challenged, not the shoulder of the highway. Now, let's talk about one scenario that creates enormous legal problems. The driver who panics and refuses basic commands because they watch too many viral videos. This is dangerous. There's a difference between respectfully asserting rights and physically refusing lawful instructions. If an officer instructs a driver to lower the window enough for communication, or step out under lawful authority during a traffic stop, escalating physically can rapidly worsen the situation. People online oversimplify these encounters constantly. Real life is more complicated. Good legal outcomes often come from calm documentation, calm compliance where legally required, and strategic silence rather than roadside combativeness. That distinction matters enormously. Now, here's something fascinating many former officers admit privately. They often decide within the first minute whether the stop will remain routine or become more investigative. Think about that. 1 minute, sometimes less. That means your initial emotional control matters tremendously. And this is exactly why the sentence I mentioned earlier is so effective. "Officer, before I reach for anything, where would you like me to place my hands?" It immediately signals calm structure, not panic, not aggression, not performance, structure. People underestimate how rare calmness actually is during police encounters. Now, let's discuss why tinted window stops psychologically scare people more than other stops. Because darkness creates mystery. When visibility is limited, imagination fills gaps. Drivers fear what officers assume. Officers fear what drivers may be hiding. That mutual uncertainty creates tension before words even begin. Understanding that dynamic changes how smart people handle the encounter. Instead of reacting emotionally, they reduce uncertainty intentionally. Visible hands, slow movements, short responses, no sudden digging, no frantic explanations, no unnecessary admissions. Simple, controlled, predictable. Now, there's another important warning here for people carrying lawful firearms. This area becomes extremely state-specific. Some states require immediate disclosure under certain conditions. Others do not. Some officers appreciate immediate notification. Others prefer drivers keep hands visible first and speak carefully. The biggest mistake armed drivers make is sudden movement toward the firearm area while attempting to explain themselves. That terrifies officers instantly. If you are lawfully armed, calm verbal communication matters more than almost anything else. And this is another reason why structured language helps so much during stops. Now let's touch on something uncomfortable but true. Many drivers unknowingly incriminate themselves through jokes. People laugh nervously and say things like, "There's definitely not a body in the trunk. You're not going to find my cocaine. Don't shoot me. Guess you caught me." Terrible idea. Officers hear bizarre things constantly. Humor does not translate well during investigative encounters, especially when body cams are recording, especially when reports are written later, especially when prosecutors review footage. Nervous humor has destroyed cases before. That sounds unbelievable until you see it happen. Now, here's a question people rarely ask themselves. Why do officers often stand slightly behind the driver window instead of directly beside it? Visibility and reaction time. Again, officer safety strategy shapes traffic stop choreography constantly. Tint interferes with visibility. So, officers compensate through positioning, lighting, observation angles, and behavioral analysis. Once you understand that framework, their actions start making more sense psychologically. And when things make sense psychologically, drivers react more intelligently. Now, let's discuss refusal behavior, because this confuses people badly. Refusing consent to search is not the same as resisting. Those are different things entirely. A calm refusal sounds like this. "I don't consent to searches, officer." That's it. No speech, no anger, no courtroom monologue, no internet lawyer performance. Short and clear. People who stay emotionally disciplined generally protect themselves better legally than people trying to dominate the interaction verbally. Now, here's another reality many viewers may not like hearing. Sometimes officers already know much more than drivers realize before initiating contact. License plate readers, prior alerts, vehicle descriptions, recent area reports, warrants, suspensions, registration issues, insurance flags, prior stop history. The tinted windows may simply provide a clean reason to initiate contact and confirm observations. That's why some officers appear unusually focused immediately. Drivers mistakenly assume the stop began randomly at the traffic violation itself. Sometimes it didn't. Now, think about how dangerous nervous lying becomes in that situation. An officer asks, "Where are you coming from tonight?" Driver says, "Nowhere." Meanwhile, surveillance cameras already placed the vehicle outside a bar 30 minutes earlier, or passengers contradict the statement instantly, or timestamps expose inconsistencies. People underestimate how often small lies create larger suspicion. And once credibility collapses, everything else becomes harder. Now, here's something defense lawyers constantly emphasize. Many cases are not destroyed by major crimes. They're damaged by small preventable mistakes during initial contact, talking too much, consenting unnecessarily, making sudden movements, arguing emotionally, giving inconsistent statements, displaying panic behavior, trying too hard to appear innocent. That last one surprises people. Overcompensation itself can look suspicious. Calmness tends to look more believable than theatrical innocence. Now, let's talk about something the most drivers never notice: the silence after you answer a question. Experienced officers use silence strategically. Why? Because silence makes nervous people keep talking. An officer asks, "Do you know why I stopped you?" Driver answers. Officer stays quiet, and suddenly the driver starts rambling. I wasn't speeding that much. I only had 2 drinks. I was texting for 1 second. Nobody forced those admissions out. Psychological discomfort produced them. That's why emotional discipline matters so much during stops. Now here's a final warning specifically for tinted window drivers. Never mistake familiarity for immunity. Just because you drove for years without problems does not mean tonight's stop stays minor. The wrong attitude, wrong movement, wrong statement, wrong passenger behavior, or wrong consent decision can completely transform the encounter. And sometimes the people who get into the worst legal situations are not hardened criminals. They're ordinary drivers who panic. That's what makes these situations dangerous. Not everybody loses control through aggression. Many lose control through nervous cooperation. There's a difference. The smartest drivers understand something most people never fully learn. Traffic stops are psychological encounters long before they become legal ones. And the moment you understand that, your behavior changes completely.